She was 9 years old. At the time, she weighed 60 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes. A fourth grader at Holmes Elementary who was shy around strangers but lit up around people she knew. She was small for her age, 4 feet 4 inches, small enough that she could only carry 7 boxes at a time. That detail matters, because on the afternoon of March 6, 1959, 7 boxes was everything she had when she stepped out of her front door into a Spokane neighborhood she had spent her whole short life learning to love. Her name was Candace Rogers, and she had a plan. She was a bluebird, the junior level of Campfire Girls of America. March 6th was the very first day of the mint selling season. The first day she could go door to door, knock on familiar faces, and work towards something she had been looking forward to for weeks. A sales badge. And if she sold enough, a free week of summer camp. She wasn't thinking about danger. She was thinking about summer camp. She lived with her mother Elaine above a neighborhood grocery store on the 2100 block of West Mission Avenue in West Central Spokane. Her grandparents lived right next door. She had a dog named Shep. After school, she went straight to her troop leader's house, picked up her 7 boxes, came home, and waited. The official start time was 4 p.m., so she sat with her grandmother, ate an oatmeal cookie, played with Shep, talked through her route, which neighbors would definitely buy, which ones she'd have to work on. She had thought about this. She had a list in her head. She was not nervous. She was a 9-year-old girl with a plan, a goal, and a whole street full of neighbors she already knew by name. At exactly 4 p.m., Candy Rogers picked up her 7 boxes, stepped out into the cold March air, and started knocking on doors. Nobody on that street watched her go. There was no reason to.
In the Pacific Northwest in early March, darkness comes fast. By 5:30 p.m., the streetlights were already on. Candy knew the rule. Every child on that street knew it. Home before the lights. So when 5:30 passed and she hadn't walked back through the door, her grandfather went outside, checked the neighbors, walked the block, asked around. Nobody had seen her. Not recently. Her mother Elaine had been at a hair appointment. She came home to an empty apartment and a grandfather who had already run out of places to look. Within the hour, the whole family was out in the streets. By nightfall, police were called. There were other Campfire Girls out that same evening, dozens of little girls. Same uniforms, same boxes, same neighborhoods. That made Candy almost impossible to trace. Witnesses thought they saw her and couldn't be certain which child was her. Then around 9 p.m., something changed. On Pettit Drive, a road, climbing a hill the locals called Doomsday Hill, boxes of Campfire mints were scattered across the ground. Not dropped, scattered. Like they had been thrown from a moving car window by someone leaving fast. The trail ran south across the Fort George Wright Bridge, away from Candy's neighborhood, away from everything she knew. One box had a partial fingerprint on it. Lifted. Preserved. Sent to the FBI. Never identified. By 9 p.m. on March 6, 1959, Spokane understood something it did not want to understand. Candy Rogers had not wandered off. She had not stayed out past dark. She had not broken the rule. Someone had taken her, a 9-year-old girl. At the time, she weighed 60 pounds. Too small to carry more than 7 boxes. A chosen. And somewhere in Spokane that night, the evidence that would one day name the man who took her was already in custody, preserved by people who had no idea what they were holding. It would wait 62 years. By the morning of March 7th, 1959, there was not a person in Spokane who did not know her name, and more than 1,200 of them showed up to find her. Marines, Boy Scouts, mail carriers, utility workers, people on horseback. They came before sunrise. They came without being asked. A command post was set up at the intersection of Pettit Drive and the T.J. Meenak Bridge, right where her mint boxes had been found the night before. The U.S. Air Force sent helicopters for aerial coverage. Every available police officer, every detective, every sheriff's deputy was assigned to the case. This was 1959. No cell phones, no GPS, no security cameras. They had scattered mint boxes, one unidentified fingerprint, and a trail that ended at the edge of a bridge. That was everything. And on March 7th, just one day after Candy disappeared, a U.S. Air Force Sikorsky H-19 helicopter flying low over the search area struck high-tension power lines and crashed into the Spokane River. 3 crew members were killed. Airman Marlise D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonnell, Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fautek. 2 others survived. 3 men, named, gone. They did not know Candy Rogers. They had never met her mother or her grandfather or her grandmother who made oatmeal cookies. They just came to help find a little girl. And they did not come home either. The city was now carrying something it had no language for, and Candy had still not been found. The days that followed were the worst kind of quiet. Tips flooded in from across the country, hundreds, then thousands. Detectives followed every one. They pulled records, and they contacted anyone with a relevant criminal history in the area. In 1959, there was no sex offender registry, no database to cross-reference, no system to flag who had done something like this before. Investigators were working with paper files, phone calls, and gut instinct. Several persons of interest emerged. None could be connected to Candy with anything solid. 16 days went by. Then on March 21st, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were off duty, hunting in the woods off Old Trails Road, about 7 miles from Candy's home. Moving through the trees near an abandoned rock quarry, one of them noticed something at the base of a tree. A pair of small girls' shoes, placed there. Not thrown, not dropped in a hurry. Left. They went back to base, talked about it on the way, kept coming back to the same question, reported it. And that night, Candy's family knew the shoes had been found. They waited for morning. The next day, a search party arrived at daybreak. One of the searchers pushed aside a pile of brush and pine needles. Candy Rogers was there, concealed under branches and dead tree boughs. About 50 yards off the road, 7 miles from the neighborhood she had spent her whole life in. Retired Spokane police. Captain Richard Alberding was one of the officers who found her that morning. He carried what he saw for the rest of his life. He would still be alive 62 years later, when the man responsible was finally named. The cause of death was rape and then strangulation. Her own clothing had been used against her, a strip torn from what she was wearing used as a ligature, her feet bound with another strip of the same garment. The examiners confirmed she had been assaulted. She was 9 years old. Her mother and grandparents would spend the rest of their lives not knowing who'd done this to her. They died that way. What investigators preserved from that scene, biological evidence collected from Candy's clothing, was handled with a care nobody could have fully explained at the time. 1959, DNA analysis did not exist. Nobody in that evidence room understood what genetic material could one day tell them. But they treated what they had carefully, cataloged it, sealed it, kept it. That decision, made in a year when the tools to use it were decades away, is the only reason this case has an ending. The discovery changed Spokane in ways that held for generations. Parents who had never thought twice about children walking alone now watched from windows. New rules, new fears. The case wove itself into how families raised their children for decades after. Watch where you go. Remember what happened to that little girl? The investigation was now a homicide case with evidence, a community that was not letting go, and a killer who had left no obvious trail behind. Detectives had a biological sample they didn't yet know how to use, and a file that was never going to be closed. For 40 years, detectives in Spokane believed they knew who killed Candy Rogers. They were wrong. And the man they were wrong about had a name, a history, and a piece of evidence that seemed to point directly at him. For 4 decades, that case felt solid. It was not. His name was Hugh Bayan Morse. He was a member of the Spokane Motorcycle Club. The kind of man who moved through a community without raising alarm. When Candy went missing, he showed up to help search. Walked those same streets alongside grieving neighbors and determined officers. Morse had a history. 4 years before Candy disappeared, he had been picked up in California for attempting to assault 2 Girl Scouts selling cookies door to door. A direct echo of what happened to Candy. He was in the Spokane area at the time of her disappearance, and he had a habit: grape-flavored gum. At nearly every crime scene connected to him, investigators found it. During Candy's autopsy, a detective noted a stain on her clothing, purple in color. When examined closely, a grape smell. That single observation took on a life of its own. And as Morse's history became clearer over the years, that stain became the centerpiece of the case against him. It was never tested, never proven. An assumption that hardened into near certainty and pointed every detective who touched this file in the wrong direction for 4 decades. Less than a year after Candy's body was found, Morse went on to kill 2 women in Spokane. He continued across the country, committing at least 7 more violent offenses. Before being caught in Minnesota in 1961, he died in a Minnesota prison in April 2003, serving 2 life sentences. The profile fit, the geography fit, the pattern fit. The DNA did not. In the early 2000s, Detective Mindy Connolly submitted Candy's clothing to a forensic lab. A scientist isolated a biological sample from the preserved evidence and built a full DNA profile, the first time in over 40 years that investigators had anything beyond circumstantial suspicion. They tested it against Hugh Morse, no match. The profile was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. 0 results. Complete silence. The real killer had never been arrested for anything requiring a DNA sample. His name had not appeared once, not in a tip, not in a report, not anywhere in 6 decades of investigation. He had been there the whole time. Nobody had looked at him. 3 generations of detectives had worked this case. 3 generations had handed this file forward with the same unspoken instruction. Don't let her be forgotten. Detective Brian Hammond carried it for 16 years, and he retired in 2020, still wanting to solve it, still believing someone would. Then in 2018, something shifted. California investigators used a method called forensic genetic genealogy to identify the Golden State Killer, a violent offender who had evaded capture for 40 years. The technique worked by running crime scene DNA through public ancestry databases, finding distant relatives of an unknown suspect, then building out family trees until one name emerged. The moment that arrest made international news, law enforcement agencies across the country pulled out their oldest unsolved cases and asked the same question. Could this work for us? Spokane asked it immediately. The case went to Brittany Wright, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. Wright grew up in Spokane. As a child, her own parents told her about Candy Rogers. Not as a news story, as a warning. She had spent her entire career in forensic science. Now the case that shaped her childhood was sitting on her desk. She was the fourth detective generation to inherit this file, and she was not done yet. In 2020, Wright submitted the sample to a private genealogy laboratory. They sent it back. Too degraded, they said. They declined the case. That rejection was close to the end of the road. CODIS had returned nothing. 4 decades had gone to the wrong man. The one private lab willing to attempt forensic genealogy had just walked away. If the next move failed, it was over. Here at Crime Chronicles, we cover cases like this one because the people inside them deserve to be remembered accurately, and every case takes weeks of research and verified sources. Candy Rogers waited 62 years for her story to be told correctly. If that means something to you, subscribe, drop a comment below, and stay with us. Because what one forensic scientist did next is the only reason this case has an ending at all. There was one lab left. Just one. Brittany Wright had heard about a company in Texas called Othram. Not a general forensics lab, built specifically for cases other labs turned away. Degraded samples, contaminated evidence, material so compromised that standard testing couldn't touch it. They had developed their own method, forensic-grade genome sequencing, and they had never turned down a case because the DNA was too far gone. Wright contacted them in February 2021. She described the sample, what remained of it, what it had been through. 62 years of age, non-human contamination, degradation that had already caused one lab to walk away without looking back. Othram said they could try. She packaged what was left and sent it to Texas. By that point, the sample was down to the very last usable amount. Not much. Barely enough. It was everything. Othram received the extract in March 2021. 6 months of work followed. They sequenced what they had, built a genealogical profile from material that should not have yielded one, then ran that profile through ancestry databases, searching for distant relatives, people who shared enough DNA with the unknown contributor to start building a family tree. By Labor Day weekend, September 6th, 2021, they had results. The profile narrowed to 3 brothers, all deceased, all from Spokane: John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, Terry Allen Hoff. 6 decades of investigation, hundreds of tips, thousands of hours, 3 generations of detectives, and a name that had never once appeared in a single police report came back 3 times on the same page. There was a problem. A forensic genealogy can narrow a search to a generation, but it cannot distinguish between siblings. Brothers share too much DNA. The profile pointed to the Hoff family. It could not say which one. Investigators needed a living relative. Only one of the three brothers had children, John Ray Hoff. Sergeant Zach Stormont picked up the phone and called a woman named Kathy Hoff. He identified himself as a cold case investigator who needed her help. He did not tell her everything, not yet. Within 45 minutes of that call, she was at Spokane Police Headquarters. But she already knew. She had not waited passively after a call from a detective she had never heard of. She went online in those 45 minutes, searched, somewhere between that phone call and walking through the door of a police station. She found the story of a 9-year-old girl murdered in Spokane in 1959 while selling campfire mints. She walked in already carrying the weight of what she suspected. Kathy volunteered her DNA without hesitation. His daughter was 9 years old when he died, the same age as Candy. She had spent her whole life believing he was just a man who struggled. The results came back September 8th, 2021. The DNA recovered from Candy's clothing was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy Hoff than to any random person from the general population. Strong evidence of paternity. But Stormont was not ready to name anyone. He knew there was a chance, however small, that there was another brother they hadn't identified, a paternity question they hadn't accounted for. He'd carried this case long enough to know that close was not the same as certain. Certain was the only thing good enough for Candy Rogers. He obtained a warrant. On September 23rd, 2021, 62 years after a 9-year-old girl walked out of her front door with 7 boxes of mints, investigators exhumed the body of John Ray Hoff. The results came back October 1st. The probability that the DNA from Candy's clothing belonged to John Ray Hoff, rather than an unrelated person, was 25 quintillion to 1. The number 25, followed by 18 zeros. Stormont had his answer. After 6 decades, 3 generations of detectives, 1 rejected sample, and 1 lab in Texas that said they could try, a name had finally entered the file. John Ray Hoff, a man who had lived 1 mile from Candy Rogers, a man who had never once been a suspect, a man who had been dead for 51 years. John Ray Hoff was not a drifter, not a stranger passing through. He was born in Spokane, raised in Spokane. On the day Candy Rogers walked out of her front door with 7 boxes of mints, he was 20 years old and living 1 mile away. He knew that neighborhood. He knew those streets. He'd spent his entire life in that city. That is what makes it worse. He grew up on the 2500 block of West College Avenue. Juvenile trouble early. That record pushed him into the military at 17, assigned to the Nike missile sites protecting Fairchild Air Force Base, right outside the city he had grown up in. Local, known, familiar, and completely invisible to 6 decades of investigation. 2 years after Candy was murdered, Hoff attacked a woman in Brown's Addition in West Spokane. He grabbed her, removed her clothing, as he bound her using her own garments, choked her before fleeing the scene. She survived. He used his victim's own clothing to restrain her, her own clothing against her throat. That is an exact match to what was done to Candy Rogers. The ligature around Candy's neck was torn from what she was wearing, her ankles bound with another strip of the same garment. The 1961 victim survived because something interrupted him. Candy did not. Hoff served 6 months for that attack. 6 months. The Army declared him a deserter and discharged him. He sold Cutco cutlery door to door after that. worked at Western Pine Lumber, put in time at the Armor meat packing plant where he suffered a chemical burn on his face. He was not building a life. In 1970, at the age of 31, John Ray Hoff died by suicide. And there is a detail about Hoff that lands harder than any of the others. He had a stepsister. She was 10 years old in 1959, a campfire girl. And she was Candy Rogers' assigned big sister in the program, the older girl whose job was to guide her, look out for her, help her work toward her badges. She knew Candy. She cared about Candy. When Candy disappeared and Spokane came apart searching for her, this girl was devastated. She sat next to her brother, next to John Hoff, and cried. Told him how much she missed her little campfire sister. Told him how terrible it all was. He sat there and said nothing. She was crying about a little girl he already knew was gone. And he let her. She carried that grief for 62 years as an innocent bystander, never knowing the person responsible for it was sitting right beside her the whole time. Indeed, when investigators located where Hoff had been buried, the room went quiet. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff had been buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. Yards away, same ground, same silence. While her family visited her grave and still had no answers, he was there. After the case was solved, the Hoff family made a decision without being asked. They had his remains moved to a different cemetery so that Candy could have some peace. When Candy's cousin Joanne heard that, she was overcome. That gesture from the killer's family to the victims was not justice, but it was the only thing they had the power to give. Kathy Hoff gave a recorded statement at the November 19th press conference. She did not deflect. She did not look away. I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did. I hope that it gives her peace, knowing that even though it's not really justice, his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved. At that same press conference, retired Captain Richard Olberding sat in the audience. He was one of the officers who found Candy's body on March 22, 1959. He had pushed aside that pile of brush and pine needles and seen what John Hoff had left behind. He carried that for 62 years. He was still alive to hear the name. I thank God, he said, that I lived long enough to see the end of this case. Sergeant Stormont, when asked how many hours had been spent on this investigation across 6 decades, did not give a number. This isn't measured in hours, he said. This is measured in careers. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She had a badge to earn, a dog named Shep, and a grandmother who made oatmeal cookies. That was the whole of her world on March 6, 1959. John Ray Hoff took every year that came after it. The file stayed open for 62 years. 3 generations of detectives made sure of that. And one forensic scientist who grew up hearing her name as a warning made sure it finally closed.